We're going to do a brief recap now on what happened yesterday. One of the things that you'll remember is that yesterday we came up with some conversation guidelines. We started with 4 and then you added loads more. We're just having those typed up, and there'll be copies on your tables, not just today, but for all of the future meetings of all of the other future meetings of the Assembly. So you'll be able to see your own handiwork. But to recap on the rest of the day and some of the other things that happened yesterday, I'm going to hand over to Kate.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and good morning, everybody. I thought I'd start off just by reiterating what the role is for David and I. We're here. We've got a stewarding role, and that means that we are ensuring that this whole process is independent from government, that it's open, accessible, transparent, and that we've all got the chance to kind of learn each weekend. So it's a kind of cumulative learning approach. And that everything, it's not one weekend and then the next weekend and then the next weekend. It's really a kind of a process across the 6 weekends. That we're convening on the day and making sure that everything runs smoothly and it works for you, and that we enable you to give of your time to the best ability, and also representing you, representing the chat, the process, and how you're feeling to the wider public. But if anybody does feel comfortable in sharing their views and ideas about the process, just come up and have a chat with us or talk to Ian, because we'd love to hear from people who want to do that. So I think, reflecting on yesterday, it feels like the amount of time it takes for the room to dampen down now that we all actually got to know each other quite well yesterday. And I think that was really... I think it's a reflection on your openness and transparency. It's transparency in this process that you've all agreed already to kind of chat and share so openly. And that you got to know a little bit about the process, about what we're going to be doing over the next 6 weeks. But I think it's important to restate this and not to underestimate that if it still feels a little bit woolly and we're not quite sure why we're here, don't worry. It genuinely is a journey. When you're on a train and you look out the window at the first couple of stops, you have no clue where you are because you've left where you're coming from and you don't know where you're going to. So just, let that feeling sit and don't worry about it. It is, clarity will come as we move along. And then yesterday you very kindly listed your hopes and fears. And interestingly, as is often the case, the hopes and fears kind of mirror each other a little bit. So there were hopes and fears around Brexit. There was hopes and fears about being listened to and having something to say and having the kind of confidence to say it. There were fears about constitutional change and what that may mean. And there was also fears about a kind of wide-ranging set of policies around jobs and services and cost of living. And I think we will get the opportunity to drill down and take some of those fears on, head on, over the coming weeks. And the hopes were really about feeling able to contribute and having something to say, and working respectfully, with everybody treated fairly. And I thought this one came quite clearly, having the courage to share your own truths. And I hope that we will set up the process to allow you to have that courage. And that everybody's views are heard and included, and that the process helps to heal divisions, which I thought was a really moving way to put it. And then wider than that, having an impact on and improving our society, and that this process is something that is positive for the future of Scotland. So I thought that was a very warm note to leave it on, and I just wanted to let you know that all the comments will be recorded and grouped and shared online as part of this learning journey together within the room, and also for those out with the room. And just wanted to end saying that a couple of people said they had absolutely no fears at all. Thank you very much. That's where we want to be. So please enjoy the rest of the day in the spirit with which you've started it. Thanks.
Thank you, Kate. So we're now going to start with the first information session. Now, there's going to be quite a few of these over the course of the next few weekends. I just want to say a little bit about them. One of the things that is important in all of this process is that you're thinking about the information that you receive, of course, but also think about what's being missed, or what we've assumed that you know that you didn't know, or what we've assumed that you didn't know that you did know. And think a bit about if you were in the position of a citizen who isn't in the room, what of this information is really useful to you? Because when we come back to our remit, the last thing in the remit is what information do the citizens of Scotland need to be able to take some of these decisions? And you're their voice. You're the people who are going to be able to make the recommendations to say, oh, we think this information is really important, or we think these questions need answering. And so that's one of the things I'd really like you to do while you're listening to Nicola McEwen, who's going to be talking about how decisions are made for and about Scotland, but also when you listen to all of the experts and all of the evidence over the next few weekends. Because right at the end of the process, we'll be asking you to make recommendations about what sort of information should be out there and how people should be receiving it. So that's something to think about. We have also tried to make it as easy as possible for you to feedback while the speakers are speaking. So you have on your table yellow cards and red cards. The yellow cards mean slow down, which is something I hear a lot. The red cards mean stop, I don't understand. Can you go over that again? So much as with football, people hate receiving red cards. When you're standing at the front, you want to make sure everyone is understanding what's going on. Feel free to use those cards. If you feel a bit embarrassed, say, well, am I the only person who doesn't understand this? Don't worry. You know, if you're the only person who doesn't understand it, I'd be surprised. Probably other people are equally feeling shy about saying it, so just hold the card up, or if you're feeling really shy, ask your table facilitator to do it for you. So lots of opportunities to get people to slow down, to repeat, and so on and so forth. And the first thing that we're going to be hearing about is how decisions are made for and about Scotland. So I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Nicola McEwen. She's a professor at the University of Edinburgh, and she's been teaching and researching constitutional law and constitutional politics for 2 decades. So this session is about introducing to you the issues around the Constitution and learning about how decisions are taken right now for and about Scotland. So, Nicola.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you this morning. As Anthony was saying, I've been looking at this for quite a long time now. Our centre, our researchers, we don't take a position on any of this. We're not for or against anything. We're just trying to understand it and try to explain it as best as we can. So the 3 themes that I wanted to talk about this morning were thinking about the ways in which decisions are made. So I'm going to jump about a wee bit, and I'm not going in date order because I wanted to just look at the different processes that we've used in Scotland so far to make decisions about Scotland's constitutional future. And then explain a bit more about the powers of the Scottish Parliament just now, how that links in with the powers of the Westminster Parliament, the UK Parliament, and how that has evolved. And then finally, and just briefly, look at the different options for the future, which includes more or less staying where we are now, or different change options as well. Okay. So, I can't really see these slides from here. Okay, so the first tool, if you like, we've used for making... Hang on. Right. The first tool we've used for making decisions is the referendum. So the first referendum that we had was in 1979. I'm not going to talk about that one, but the one that led to the establishment of the Scottish Parliament was the referendum in 1997. And sorry, these are not quite the slides that I had sent you, but that's okay. So perhaps we'll post the slides that we did send, but that's fine. I'll improvise slightly. So what we have here on the slides is a copy of the ballot paper that was used to allow people to make the decision and to decide on the outcome. So there were 2 questions in that referendum. The first was, do you agree that there should be, a Scottish Parliament? Or do you not agree? And then the second one was about, do you want that Parliament to have tax powers? And although this was a sort of one-day event, it was the end of the culmination of a very long process. So there'd been a very long debate about whether or not there should be a Scottish Parliament, and the result was a broad consensus in favour of that. So there had been a cross-party campaign in favour of yes, yes. There was a no campaign, and it wasn't very strong, it wasn't all that visible. And so the result was that 3/4 of the people voted for a Scottish Parliament, a little bit less voted for that Parliament to have tax powers. And you can see the result there from the Scotsman newspaper. The way that they portrayed that was a nation again. In fact, Scotland had always remained a nation within the United Kingdom since it had joined in a political union, but this was to change the way that decisions would be made about the constitution, about policy, about the things that affect your everyday lives. The referendum was used again as a tool for making decisions 5 years ago on the issue of independence. And in this occasion, it was a Scottish referendum conducted by the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament, but with the agreement of the UK Parliament and the UK Government. You see here David Cameron, who was Prime Minister at the time, Alex Salmond, who was First Minister at the time, coming together after quite a bit of negotiation to agree that the process which involved a transfer of power to the Scottish Parliament to enable it to hold an independence referendum that would be beyond legal doubt. The question, again, the ballot paper is pictured here. Fairly simple, succinct question: should Scotland be an independent country, yes or no? And this time it was a clear result in favour of the no, but it was close enough to make it difficult to say that this was a consensus view, in the way that it was relatively easy to say that the result of the first referendum in 1997 was a consensus view. So a little bit more divided, in other words, a more contentious issue, but clear enough for that to be accepted. So that's for referendums. Another way in which change to the constitutional arrangements of Scotland has been decided has been through commissions. In this case, the Calman Commission was a sort of what you might call an elite commissioner, the great and the good coming together to reflect upon the powers of the Parliament and whether they should be changed, and to make recommendations. So the people that served on that commission were maybe former ministers, lords, university chancellors, that kind of thing. They took quite a long time to think about it and reflect upon it, and then they came up with their recommendations. They had a specific remit. Their remit was to think about the powers, to think about, in particular, the tax powers, and also specifically to think about ways to cement Scotland's place within the United Kingdom. So it was a commission supported by the UK government, but not on this occasion by the Scottish government. But it did lead to change in the laws and change in the powers of the Parliament. And then the other commission was somewhat different. This was the most recent commission called the Smith Commission that led to the most recent set of changes of the laws around the powers of the Scottish Parliament. And that was set up, it was inspired by a commitment made towards the end of the independence referendum campaign, when the three parties that were supporting the no side jointly came together to make a commitment to review the powers, to bring forward changes. They talked about, there was a vow, it appeared in the Daily Record a few days before the vote, and it was a commitment to permanent and extensive new powers and faster, safer, better change than separation. I have this picture here of a roller coaster ride, partly because the emphasis was indeed on speed. They had about 6 weeks. The parties, all of the parties, came together, including the SNP. They came around a table. They spent about 6 weeks deciding what would be the change to take place. And the report that they made eventually made its way into the Scotland Act 2016, which is the basis of the powers of the Parliament as they exist just now. I'll come to that in a moment, but just the final thing to note is that whatever process is used, whether it's a referendum or an elite commission or a cross-party commission or indeed a citizens' assembly, ultimately changes to the constitutional powers of the Scottish Parliament require the approval of the Westminster Parliament, because they're the ones that hold the powers over the Constitution. So just briefly then to talk a little bit about the Scottish Parliament's powers and what it can decide to do. The powers of the Parliament are defined, they're defined by what it can't do. In other words, the Scottish Parliament can decide to do anything as long as it's not explicitly reserved to the UK Parliament. So as long as it's not written in the legislation that these are powers that don't belong to the Scottish Parliament, that these are powers that belong to the UK Parliament, then they can do it. So it's a sort of negative definition of power. But more or less, these are the key areas that are reserved, the key powers that are reserved to the UK Parliament. So these are the key areas that the Parliament can't make decisions in. One is the Constitution, as I already said. The others are areas like foreign policy, defence, immigration, social security, most social security, most what we call macroeconomic policy, so the big sort of fiscal powers and monetary policy, employment legislation, energy, transport, broadcasting, human genetics, things like that, aspects of elections, the civil service, and my personal favourite that I like to tell the students is outer space, although that's becoming actually quite important. So the Parliament can do anything else, in other words, but the key areas of devolved powers are around sort of domestic public policy. So health, education, the environment, agriculture, transport, the law, social work, social care, housing, sports, aspects of energy, local taxation, and that tax-varying power that was there because the referendum in 1997 gave it that power, but that's the bit that has changed perhaps the most. Gradually, since it was set up, since 1999, the Scottish Parliament has acquired more tax powers. It has become more able to raise revenue by itself. So there is still quite a bit of money that is transferred from the UK government to the Scottish government, not as a gift. It's to do with the way that taxes are collected, and a lot of taxes are still collected from Scotland centrally, and then redistributed outwards. But gradually, over the years, the Scottish Parliament has been able to agree to permit the government to raise around about half of its budget now, and that's from the most recent change. Also, in the most recent changes, there were also the other biggest area of change was around social security. So most social security, like pensions, unemployment benefit, that kind of thing, is still decided by the UK Parliament. But for the first time, really, the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, now delivers some of its own social security benefits. And these are around things like carers allowance, disability allowance, winter fuel payments, and these sorts of things. And it's been able to set up some new smaller social security payments as well. Okay, so the Scottish Parliament does have quite a broad range of domestic policy powers. That, if you look around the world, you would see sometimes it's said, is this the most powerful devolved parliament in the world. And I think for me it depends on how you define that, what you mean by powers. But it's certainly, if you look around the world up there, it has quite a bit of power. But as we know, there is a debate that's ongoing around Scotland's constitutional future, and if the arrangement that we have now is the right one or the optimal one. I'm not going to comment on that debate other than to talk about the key options for the future. The first is to not have any constitutional change, and the only thing I would say about that one is that it doesn't mean there wouldn't be any change. So you might not change the constitution, but the world around us is changing, and not least because of Brexit. So Brexit creates some challenges for the way that devolution works at the moment. So even if there was a decision to not have any further constitutional change, it doesn't mean that there won't also be changes anyway to the way that decisions are made and the way that Scotland is run. The second one is to have another reform to devolution, so more devolution for Scotland. So that's similar to the kinds of changes that we've had already. It's the Parliament within the UK, but with a bit more power over whatever areas that people determine. The third one that is sometimes talked about is federalism. And the difference between more devolution and federalism is that more devolution is specifically about Scotland. Federalism is about the whole of the UK. Federalism is about the way the whole of the UK is run. So that would require a change for the UK as a whole. And then the final one is Scottish independence. Now, all of these options for change, I think, mask a broad range of options. So that's perhaps most obvious in the case of more devolution. More devolution could be adding a little bit more power, or it could be adding a lot more power. And there are a whole range of options within that. Federalism, well, federalism can mean many different things to many different people, and we haven't really seen sort of clear proposals for what that might mean. And then independence too could mean different things to different people. What about the relationship with the European Union? How would that affect what independence would come to mean? Okay, so there are multiple options for change, and each of those options themselves are complex and contain a big list of options. Okay.
So what I'm going to ask the table facilitators to do now is to let you discuss a little bit what you just heard. I'm sure you will have lots of questions. I'm sure there will be some things that you are wanting to ask. So discuss among yourselves what your top priority questions are. Write down all of the questions that you have. As I say, they will all be answered. But mark the one or maybe the two that you think are the highest priority. And after this, we're going to have a break. And when we have the break, we are going to come back and ask those questions. And we'll go through the list as far as we can in the time that we have. And everything that we don't get to, we will answer separately. One small apology. The slides on the screen were a slightly older version, slightly longer than the version that's in your pack, which should have been on the screen as well. The version that's in your pack is the correct version. There's no significant difference between them, slightly just a difference of length. And we'll be making sure that the new version's online as well. So sorry about that, Nicola. The papers, the things that you had in the blue folders this morning? No? Okay. We'll get copies of the slides circulated. Yeah. The facilitators have them on their tables if you want to take a look. We'll make sure they're circulated and online. Okay, so discussion for 15 minutes of the questions that you think are the most important, and then we can take those priority questions after the coffee break, and we can ask them to Nicola and get some answers. So over to the table facilitators. Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, everybody. We have had an enormous number of questions, which is great. We have had lots of really interesting questions. We have had lots of questions about which you could do a 4-year degree course all on their own. And we have had lots of questions that we won't be able to answer today, but I just want to reinforce that we will be doing them in writing after today. However, we have had... Sorry? Okay, so I was going to say, thank you very much for all your questions. There were loads. Some of them were like deep philosophy. You could do 4 years of a degree course on them. Some of them were really simple and factual. All of them will be answered. Not all of them will be answered now. However, lots of the questions from the tables were quite similar, so there were some groups that were pretty clear. I'm going to ask Kate and David now to ask those top questions to Nicola.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And just to repeat, if your question's not asked, it will be answered in some form at some time. But I want to start with a range of questions which are about one of the specific slides that Nicola put up, which was about the various constitutional options. People wanted to know what kind of new devolved powers could come to Scotland if we went for that option. A lot of people didn't really understand what federalism meant or how it might function and what changes that might mean in England. Other people wanted to know what the status quo was, because Nicola hinted that if we stick to status quo, it's not necessarily the status quo because of Brexit. What is meant by that? How will Brexit change things? So a whole range of questions relating to what federalism, what further devolved powers might mean, and linked to that, questions kind of about how we got to where we are today anyway. And Nicola ran through a lot of that anyway, but I think people still want to know how we got there because they want to understand how it might change again.
Okay, so, and I think a few of the tables actually had another question that David hasn't asked me, but I'm going to answer anyway, which was about what is a constitution anyway? And forgive me, I should have started there. When we talk about a constitution, we're essentially meaning the rules, the basic rules underpinning everything else, and the way that all the decisions are made, the laws that are made, they have to be within the Constitution. So it's the basic set of rules within which we're all operating. Now, lots of countries have a constitution, a single document that is looked after by a constitutional court. The United States has that, Spain has that, lots of countries have that. The UK doesn't have that. And often I hear, sometimes my students arrive and they say, well, the UK doesn't have a constitution. That's not true. The UK does have a constitution. It's just that it's quite scattered in lots of different documents, and lots of different laws, and lots of different conventions, which makes it trickier to try and get a handle on it. Scotland doesn't have a written constitution in the traditional sense, but the rules, the set of rules that underpin everything that's decided in the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, are based on the Scotland Act. So that's the act of legislation that the UK Parliament passed for Scotland after the people of Scotland decided that they wanted a parliament. So in a sense, that is Scotland's constitutional document at the moment. It sets out the rules within which all of the decisions that are made by the devolved institutions, by the Parliament and by the government in Scotland are based on. You were asking about different constitutional options. Maybe I'll talk about the more powers option and then the federalism option separately. In terms of more powers, it can be a whole range of things. It might, for example, be that if you think about remember I said that the powers that the Parliament has in Scotland are defined by the ones that it doesn't have. So more powers would be about taking some of the powers that it doesn't have, that rest with the UK Parliament, and transferring those to Scotland. And if you think about it, then that could be a whole range of things. Mostly when people talk about that, they're meaning things like more tax powers or more powers over employment law. That's not a power that's devolved just now. Or powers over immigration, or the sorts, and they tend not to include in that the powers over defence, over foreign affairs, over the sort of maybe big issues of state that are more associated with countries that are independent. What is federalism? Federalism is essentially an idea, first of all. It's an idea about how you balance autonomy or making decisions in one place and sharing power with another place. So it's about how you balance unity and diversity. And how that translates into a constitution is that as well as having bodies like the Scottish Parliament or the National Assembly for Wales that are making powers in Scotland and in Wales, then you also have bodies at the centre where these groups come together and make powers together. And we don't have that in the UK at the moment. First of all, England doesn't have its own parliament, so England is just governed by the UK Parliament for everything. So in a federal system, England, or bits of England, would need to have some way to make decisions for themselves. And then we would also need to build a structure where those different bodies around the UK can come together and make decisions together. One of the ideas that's usually proposed around that is to, instead of having the House of Lords, to have a House of the Nations and the Regions, or a House of the Nations. So that would be one way where you could bring together the different bits around the UK to make decisions together.
Nicola, could you maybe give examples of 2 or 3 countries that have a federal structure at the moment?
Yeah, so Germany has a federal structure. The United States has a federal structure. Canada has a federal structure. There are quite a lot of countries around the world that do have a federal structure. The key thing to note is that they're not all the same federal structure. So that's why I started off with saying it's an idea, and the kind of structures that you build to bring life to that idea can vary from place to place. Yeah?
Thanks very much, Nicola. That's really, I think it's clarifying a lot of thoughts and questions across the room. You've touched on explaining actually what a constitution is and where the Scottish Constitution sits. I think, batching up a number of the questions, people are wondering, where do you find a kind of glossary of terms around all these issues, kind of plain English, straightforward wording? Is there a resource that people can look at?
I mean, there are probably a number of different resources out there. Certainly the Scottish Parliament has some quite useful resources on its website. But what I'd be very happy to do, working with the team, is to produce a glossary and then maybe just sort of one-page overviews of those different options that I talked about, if that would be useful for you. Okay, happy to do that.
I've got a yellow.
Oh, sorry, okay. All right, go on then.
Right, I'm not sure how to say this. We were saying about federation,
Uh-huh.
and it would take away the House of Lords.
Sorry.
Oh no.
I can repeat the question back. if
You
want.
tell me, and you tell me, and I'll tell them.
When we were talking about federation, because we had a chat about it at this table, you said it would take away the House of Lords, and it would be something else. I'm not sure
Yeah.
what word in. Does that mean, because in the House of Lords, they're obviously lords by title and birth, because we talked about that at this table, so they're not elected as such from the people. So if it was a federation and these, however they gather, would that be folk that like that represent Scotland like a sample
Okay, I'm just going to repeat that question for the room, if that's okay. So the question here was that the thing that Nicola mentioned about abolishing the House of Lords and replacing it with a House of Nations or a House of Nations and Regions. The question was, would that House of Nations and Regions be elected or made up by people representative of Scotland like this group, or would it still be unelected like the current House of Lords?
It would be however people designed it to be. Okay, so again, there isn't a single model. The House of Lords at the moment, some are there by title, and they've inherited their title. Lots of them are there by appointment. So they're given a life peerage to be in the House of Lords for the rest of their life because of something that they have done that is somebody's decided was worthy of that. And they are obviously making some decisions around the law. So if you were to decide that in a federal system you wanted to replace that with a federal type body, it could be that it's directly elected, as in the United States, or it could be that it's appointed, as in the Canadian system, or it could be that it's made up of those who are elected in each of the different bits of the UK, as in the German system. So then under that sort of system, then it would be representatives of the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government and the Northern Ireland Executive when it has one, and whatever was in place for England would come together there and they would make decisions centrally. So there are lots of different possibilities there, and it would depend on how people decided to design it. Well, ultimately, it would be the lawmakers, because it would be the lawmakers who were deciding on the Constitution. Now, they might be implementing a decision made somewhere else. So it might be, so in the examples I gave around a referendum, then a referendum is a decision of the people, and then the lawmakers implement that decision. That's the context that we're in just now with Brexit, right? Or they're debating about the complexities of doing that.
And I think this question kind of follows on from all of that. Why are we not taught about the Constitution and all the other situations in school?
I mean, there's always been long campaigns looking for a kind of civic education. I know this more as a mum now than as a professor, but I think, I know that the kids nowadays are taught about the Parliament and how things are made, but I don't know, I certainly wasn't when I was at school, and I'm sure many of you weren't either. So I think it is changing, but yeah, there's lots for teachers to do, I guess.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. We got not much time left, but one very quick question before I get on to the most difficult question. I always save the worst for last, or the hardest for last. But before we do that, can you just explain the difference between the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government? Because not everybody's absolutely clear about that.
Yeah. Okay, so the Scottish Parliament is elected by all of you. So every 4 or 5 years these days, we have the chance to vote for your members of the Scottish Parliament or MSPs. And in your areas, you will have the one that represents the constituency in which you live, and then you will have others that are elected through what's called a party list or an additional member list. And they all are there to represent you, and they all are there to make laws in the Scottish Parliament. The government is made up of the party or parties that together won. This is getting complicated.
Who won the election?
So it's usually made up of the party that won the election. Because of the system that we have in Scotland, sometimes, so in the current context, that party doesn't have a majority in the Parliament. It has only a minority, so it has to get agreement from others to be able to get decisions made and to make laws. And sometimes, as in the past, parties have decided to come together in a partnership, in a coalition, to form the government to make it easier for them to make laws in the Parliament, or to get decisions made in the Parliament. And then it's the responsibility of the government to essentially run the public services or to make decisions around taxes and to make sure that we are hopefully getting the service that we expect.
Thanks very much. Final question, as I say, we keep the best till last. Money. A lot of people are wondering if Scotland would be better off if it raised all its own revenue. Now, I know that's not really your field, but get onto that in future Assembly meetings. But you did talk about taxation. Why can't Scotland just raise all its taxation and give some money back to England, for example, for common services? Or how much of the money that we currently get is generated in Scotland? Because you may had that 50-50, but some people are saying, but some of the other 50% that comes from England is also raised in Scotland. Now, I'm sure you can't give exact figures and probably no figures, but you could give a general feel of how the taxation system works.
Yeah, well, I suppose that just to clarify a wee bit from what I'd said in the presentation, the biggest difference that happened from the last change around money was that now everybody who lives in Scotland pays their income taxes to the Scottish Government. It's still collected by the same people that collected it before, but that goes to the Scottish Government. And your local taxes go to the councils, but in a way that's set and framed by the Scottish Government. And there's a few other smaller ones that are Scottish decided as well. But income tax is the biggie, okay? But then there are lots of other taxes around the taxes that you pay, around VAT, for example, the businesses, corporation taxes that businesses pay. A lot of that is levied on people or companies that are based in Scotland is collected by and for the UK government. So it's the share for Scotland from those goes into the grant that is transferred to the Scottish Government for making up the other half of its budget. Why can't we have a system where all the taxes are collected in Scotland and then you pay a portion for common services? There is no reason why not. It's just that's not the decision that's been made. That would be an unusual system, but not a unique one. So, for example, there is a region in Spain, or two regions in Spain, the Basque Country and Navarra, that have a system like that. They collect all of the taxes themselves, and then they pay for their share of the common services that the Spanish government decides for all of Spain. So that's definitely an option. What was your other?
I think that's more or less
Is that it?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
but there are lots of different options and lots of different balances within that.
Nicola, thank you very much. I think that for me, the measure of a good presentation is always that it raises as many questions as it answers, and I think we've set the room thinking on these issues. Just one thing to sort of test the temperature. I said that I think tax and the way that money is spent in this country is an important issue for this Assembly. Is that generally the feeling that people would like to have a detailed discussion on that issue at some time in the future? Yeah. Okay, so we'll make sure at some future Assembly we have a discussion on that. Once again, Nicola, thank you very much. Back to you, Anthony.
Thank you very much. And on that question about tax and setting the challenges, the first thing we'll be doing, one of the early things we'll be doing in the next weekend, is picking those challenges and picking the things that you want to dive a bit deeper on. So if you come to the end of this weekend and think, well, what did we learn other than general stuff? The answer is you did the preparation so that next time we're going to dive straight in and get into selecting the things that you really want to hear more about. So thank you for that, Nicola. Now we're going to hear a bit more about the Scotland that you know and the Scotland that you don't know. And we're going to go a little bit into some of the data and some of the detail with David and Kate. Before I hand over to them, I'd just like to say, after this, we're going to be asking you at your tables what you found interesting or important, like what was the most important thing you heard from David and Kate's presentation about the state of Scotland today, and what's something that you heard that you didn't know already? You know, the most interesting new thing that you learned. And that'll be the topic of the discussion in the next session. So one thing to keep an eye on while you listen to their presentation.
Thanks very much, Anthony. And just to reiterate that we're going to do quite a data-heavy piece now, but that there is an opportunity to see the slides and look at the information that we're reading out to you. So don't be worrying too much about taking notes. But yeah, over the course of the Assembly, you'll have the opportunity to discuss a range of evidence about Scotland and the challenges and opportunities for the country. And as we start this journey, we thought it might be helpful to set out a few of our own thoughts about Scotland and a taster of some of the facts and figures that we've learnt as we've prepared for the Assembly, and some of our ideas and the kind of issues that we think are important, and you've already started to touch on those. Now, I should stress that neither David or I are experts in this, and so what we say should not be regarded in any way as definitive, but the facts and figures are drawn from official statistics, so you can be confident that they're as accurate as they can be.
It's an obvious point, but no less important for that what makes Scotland is the people who live and work here. But how much do we know about who we are? Maybe the place to start is to say that there are just under 5.5 million people living in Scotland. This may not be an awful lot compared to some countries. For example, there are just over 65.5 million people in the whole of the UK and around 513 million in the whole of the EU. But we are not dissimilar to others around us. Ireland, Denmark, Finland, Slovakia and Croatia all have similar populations. In fact, 12 of the current 28 EU member states also have populations of less than 6 million.
And of course, the population of Scotland is changing. The population of Scotland is increasing. But that's actually as a result of migration. We're not growing naturally, so to speak, since we have more deaths than births projected each year going forward. That dependency on migration is really important when you think about it in overall population terms. Now, the situation is different in the UK, and this is a point that you may have heard when the effects of immigration has been discussed by politicians in the media. The UK's population as a whole is growing at a much faster rate than Scotland's and is projected to increase by around 9% over the next 25 years. But to put that into perspective, if these changes are realised, Scotland's share of the UK population could fall, and that will be important in our economy and in politics.
And as we talk about the people of Scotland, we thought it would be interesting to talk about you, the people in the room, and how you're made up. You'll recall from when you were initially approached to join the Assembly that we wanted to ensure that we recruited a group of people broadly representative of the wider population. The good news is we've done that through making sure that where you come from broadly mirrors where people live across the country, and through the answers you gave to the questions that we asked about your age, gender, ethnicity, limiting long-term conditions, qualifications and current voting attitudes. So in essence, you are a mini Public of Scotland.
So as David has said, where you come from is broadly a mirror image of where people live across Scotland as a whole. You can see the map on the screen there, and it shows that 13% of people live in the south of Scotland, 15% in the Lothians, 13% in Glasgow, 13% in the west of Scotland, 12% in mid-Scotland and Fife, 12% in central Scotland, 14% in the northeast of Scotland, and 8% in the Highlands and Islands. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, well, these are very big areas and wondering where they come from, but we've mapped them onto the regional constituencies of the Scottish Parliament. MSPs are elected to represent these regions under the second vote that you have in those elections. And we chose those regions to ensure that we had coverage of all of Scotland at a high level. And then the postcodes were chosen randomly from within these areas to ensure kind of better representation. But at a level where we could maintain some level of confidentiality about where members come from. So you can see on the map, the most highly populated part of the country is the Lothians, and the lowest is the Highlands and Islands. And is that broadly what you would have expected to see, or is it kind of, well, that's good. But where people live in Scotland is changing. Now, it's well known that most of us live in cities and towns, but I think it's an interesting fact that we live on just over 2% of the land mass. So 98% of the land is not is not habited, and people are increasingly moving from west to east in the country, with rural populations continuing to decline. The fastest growing council area in Scotland is Midlothian, which, as most of you will know, is just south of Edinburgh, and the area where population is falling most is Inverclyde, which is in the west of the country. Now, I think some of these reasons for these changes are fairly obvious, especially around changes to the economy and where more new jobs can be found. But maybe it's surprising that Lothians, Inverclyde, and all the areas that we've got noted up on the map. And you might want to talk about the changes from rural to urban, and the changes that you're seeing in your own communities. And it's important also to note that where we live is changing, but how we live is also changing. More houses are being built, but there are fewer people living in them than ever before. 1 in 3 of the adult population now live on their own.
And the age range of the people in the room broadly mirrors that of the wider adult population as well. And again, as you can see on the slide, 21%, just about 1 in 5 of the Scottish adult population are aged 16 to 19. 23% are aged 30 to 44. 26 are aged 45 to 59. 20% are aged 60 to 74. And 10% are aged over 75. So nearly half of our adult population are between the ages of 30 and 59 years old. And a fifth are between the ages of 16 and 29 years old, and a further fifth between 60 and 75, and 1 in 10 of the Scottish population is over 75. And we haven't mentioned the 924,477 children who make up 17% of our population. And just incidentally, in passing, let me say that both Kate and I are conscious that we want to hear the voices of children in this assembly. It was not possible to involve them directly, but we're going to meet the Children's Commissioner on Tuesday to discuss how their voices might feed into our work as well. I also should say we've spared the 810 centenarians who live in Scotland from any duty in the Citizens' Assembly. We spoke earlier about our changing total population, but our age profile matters hugely as well, of course. For example, to the kind of public services that we need, whether that be preschool and education, or more health and care services, and so on. And our ability to pay for this is affected as the size of the working population changes. It's widely recognised that we have an ageing population with a falling birth rate and people are living longer. Life expectancy for a man in Scotland is actually now 77 years, and for a woman 81.1 years. But one of the really striking statistics about Scotland is the difference in life expectancy according to where people live. Men and women in the most deprived areas of Scotland on average live 13 years and 9.6 years less than in the most affluent parts of the country. These, I don't need to tell you, are very big differences. And we wanted to show you a slide which puts this into perspective. And some of you might recognise this map. It's the urban rail line in Glasgow. The slide was developed by an expert called Jerry McCartney, using profiles developed by the Scottish Public Health Observatory, and it was published in June 2015. The slide shows the difference in life expectancy from one side of Glasgow to the other, the same city. By comparing the overall figures, it shows that male life expectancy falls by the equivalent of around 2 years for every station on the train line in Glasgow, travelling from Jordanhill, which is in the more, for those of you who don't know it, in the more affluent West End part of Glasgow, to Bridgeton in the less affluent East End of Glasgow. Overall, on average, a man born in Bridgeton will live 14.3 years less and a woman 11.7 years less than their counterparts in Jordanhill. These are very striking statistics which highlight the very real issues around health inequalities in Scotland. How important are things like this to you? I'm hoping you'll be discussing this and things around this issue when we come to talk about the sort of country and the kind of country we want to build.
One of the unusual features of this Citizens' Assembly is that we do have 2 conveners, and that was a deliberate decision by the Scottish Government to make sure that we had proper gender balance in the role. As you'll see from the slide, that is broadly representative of the wider population as well. There are slightly more women than men in the Citizens' Assembly, and as the slide shows, that echoes the Scots, identifying 52% as female and 48% as male.
Kate spoke about the importance of migration earlier, and it's an issue that is often talked about, but I would argue often misunderstood. To put this into perspective in Scotland, the overwhelming majority of people living in Scotland, nearly 90% of them, still identify themselves as white, Scottish or British. The slide shows a more precise breakdown, and again, this broadly mirrors the ethnic background of the people in the room. 77% identify as white Scottish, 12% as white British, 7% as white other, and 4% as belonging to the other ethnic group. And can I say to at least one of the 7% of the white other, congratulations on South Africa defeating Wales, although I personally was rooting for the other side. But anyway, but again, is that breakdown what you would have expected? But we are nevertheless becoming a more diverse country. Scotland's official languages may be English, Gaelic, Scots and British Sign Language, but did you know that there are over 170 different languages spoken here? Arabic, Bengali, Cantonese, Dutch, Farsi, French, German, Hebrew, Hindi, Italian, Japanese, Kurdish, Makaton, Mandarin, Punjabi, Polish, Spanish, Turkish, Urdu, and indeed many others. Some of you may have guessed that the most common non-British nationality in Scotland is Polish. Actually, Polish is now the second most spoken language in Scotland.
In considering other ways to ensure that you would be a broadly representative sample of the wider adult population, we considered a range of different indicators about education and employment. Now, it was important that we didn't choose too many variables which would not necessarily have added very much to our discussions and, as you can imagine, would have got very complicated and made it difficult to identify who should be in the room. But we did choose to look at educational attainment, and we did this on the basis that this is widely recognised as being a useful starting point for lots of other variations. For example, the range and type of jobs that people do. We've got up on the slide showing educational attainment across the country, and you'll see that around a third of the adult population of Scotland have a degree or professional qualification. Almost a half have standard grade or higher or equivalent qualifications, and just under a fifth have no qualifications or didn't know or didn't say what qualifications they hold. Now, Scotland on the whole has a very highly educated population. We currently have the highest proportion of people aged 25 to 64 with post-secondary qualifications of any country in the EU. And of course, we're a country of learning at many different levels. I think it's interesting to note that we have over 2,500 early learning and childcare centres, and we also have a similar number of schools. And also, I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but we have 19 universities or institutes for further education. Now, we mentioned earlier on that we could not cover every aspect of the social and economic differences across Scotland, but we did think it was really important to recognise that many people's lives are affected by limiting long-term conditions. As this slide shows, almost a quarter of the adult population are affected by disability, by physical or mental health conditions, or another limiting long-term condition which has lasted or is expected to last 12 months or more, and which reduces their ability to carry out day-to-day activities. Now, I have to say that those figures really surprised David and I, but it's important to recognise within the Assembly that every individual's needs are important, and I think these numbers really challenge perceptions of who we are and the services that we need.
The final area we need to cover is political attitudes. I said yesterday some political parties criticised the government when it established the Citizens' Assembly. Those parties were concerned that the members of the Assembly might not be broadly representative of the range of political views in Scotland. That was a perfectly reasonable thing to be concerned about. To be fair to the government, one of the things that it insisted upon, apart from ensuring that we operate entirely independent of government, and of which, of course, Kate and I fully agree, is that we must ensure a properly balanced set of political perspectives in the room. This, frankly, was a tricky matter for us, since there are no official statistics on this. What we decided to do was to look at 3 different things which we thought were most important. Firstly, voting intentions for the Scottish parliamentary elections. Secondly, how people would vote in the EU referendum. And thirdly, how people would vote in a referendum on Scottish independence. To get our target quotas, we looked at the average results of opinion polls from all the major polling companies and drew an average of the last 12 months' polls at the time of recruitment. And the results of this analysis came out as follows. In terms of the Scottish Parliament elections, just under a third of the people of Scotland would vote for the SNP. Around half would vote for another political party, and a quarter would not vote or do not know how they would vote. And if there was a vote on another EU referendum tomorrow, the average of those polls say just over half of the people of Scotland would vote to remain, just under a third would vote to leave, and the rest are undecided or would not vote. And if there is a Scottish independence referendum tomorrow, the average of these polls say that 40% would vote in support of independence, 45% against, and 15% don't know or again would not vote. Obviously, these numbers will continue to change over time, and no one here is saying that we should draw from this any definitive conclusion about what Scotland thinks about political issues and what might happen in future elections or referendums. What it does show is that we can say with absolute confidence that the people in the room are a genuinely broadly representative sample of the views of the wider population of Scotland on these issues. These are important things to bear in mind as we take forward our discussions over the next few weeks. And incidentally, we've published all of these indicators on our website, and anyone who is interested in exploring the underlying data can do so there.
So I hope this quick tour of some basic facts and figures about the people of Scotland has been interesting. David and I certainly learnt a few things when putting this all together. But before handing back to your table so you can have a discussion about this, we wanted to say a few words about the challenges and opportunities facing Scotland. Now, we will, of course, have plenty of time to discuss these things in more detail over the course of the Assembly. But building on the discussions that you've already had about your hopes and your fears, and the words that you identified earlier when thinking about your experience of living in Scotland, we thought you might find it helpful for us to set out some of our thoughts. Now, of course, these are totally personal thoughts, so please do take them in that spirit.
So what kind of challenges and opportunities are we thinking about? The most immediate is what's going to happen on Brexit. As I said yesterday, we don't know if it will happen and when it will happen, and if it happens at all, on what terms we will leave the European Union. I've spent most of my working life as a member of the European Parliament, so obviously I think a lot about the impact that leaving the EU would have on Scotland. In our next weekend, we intend that you will hear some high-quality expert presentations to explore the impact of Brexit on Scotland in more detail. This will be important since no matter what your views of the pros and cons of Brexit, there are few people who would say that this will not have a major impact for a considerable period of time.
And of course, we had an initial discussion about the wider constitutional outlook with Nicola this morning. Obviously, none of us know what's going to happen on that front either. And again, whether you support independence or not, there is no doubting that will have a major impact on the country. And there are different constitutional scenarios out there as well. As Nicola set out, devolution has never really stood still since 1998. These areas of constitutional change, Brexit, independence, devolution, are going to be important aspects of our discussions. But in the relatively limited time we've got over our 6 weekends, which I mean, in some ways it feels like an enormously long time, but then in other ways it's quite short. It's going to pass quite quickly, I feel. we want to take those big changes and look at some real life issues and what the outlook is on those, what these opportunities and challenges are, as well as how they may be affected by constitutional change. Some issues are really big, and work is already in hand to engage citizens in conversation about them. I mean, you'll be aware that climate change, for example, huge issue. You may have heard that the Scottish Government is establishing a citizens' assembly to look at that in its own right. But there are many economic and social issues for Scotland. Now, you won't decide today which of those are most important to you, but as you move into the table discussions, you'll be able to be thinking and talking about some of them, kind of distilling some of this information down to move forwards.
Looking back on the presentation, we can see, for example, that migration is an important issue in our communities, for our economy and for public service delivery. People have very mixed views of the pros and cons of migration, as do politicians. But what are the facts and how are decisions made in this area? More broadly, we know that the world of work and the economy is changing. What are some of the trends? What are some of the main opportunities and challenges? And how are these affected by Brexit and other constitutional changes?
And we also talked earlier in the weekend about our own code of conduct for the Assembly and the rights and responsibility of Assembly members. Now, our rights and responsibilities as citizens and to each other more generally are incredibly important. How are these protected now, and how will they be maintained in future? And building on what David has said about migration, what about borders, free movement? What is the outlook on issues like that? And how might we be affected in different constitutional situations? Now, you'll all have your views on how well the country is run. Are we taxed too highly? Are we not taxed enough? Do we pay our fair share? Who decides on such things for Scotland, and do they do so well at the moment? Are citizens well informed and properly involved in decision making, and how can we make improvements to that? Now, some of you will be thinking about very different kinds of issues to those we've touched on so far. The quality of public services for social care or schools, or about the more local things that affect you and your families on a more personal level, and about issues in your communities.
So there are many very important issues about the country and how it is run that you're going to want to discuss over the course of the Assembly. We obviously can't take evidence on everything, but one of the really great things is that we are being given time and space to talk about what matters to us and the kind of country that we want to build. In some ways, of course, there need be no limits on our conversations. We should explore the richness and diversity of our collective experiences and ambitions.
Yeah, and as David points out, we can't talk through everything in 6 weekends, but we can make some progress on some things. And more generally, in talking to and learning from each other, we can prove that when people come together in this kind of way, that we can make real progress, that we can understand evidence, and we can agree on the facts and on the options for change, so that even if we disagree with decisions, we can agree that they have been taken fairly. Now, these will be really important things that stand in sharp contrast to much of the political debate that we see around us today. And they kind of very much chime with what the First Minister said those 6 months and 3 days now ago in setting up the Assembly. She said, we should try to find ways of debating our choices respectfully and in a way that seeks maximum areas of agreement. We should lay a foundation that allows us to move forwards together, whatever decisions we ultimately arrive at. So thanks very much for listening to us. Again, just to reiterate for David and myself, it truly is a privilege to have this chance to share our thoughts and be part of this journey with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David and Kate. Now we're going to take 20 minutes to discuss on your tables your reactions to that, what you thought was interesting, what you thought was surprising, what you thought was important. Your table facilitators are going to take notes on a flip chart so that we have a record of those, which is part of the record of the conversations we will type up. So we've got 20 minutes for that now.
So here is the really important moment that everyone has been looking forward to, which is the questionnaire. Now, I mean, this survey is really important because this is the way we can learn what's working well for you so far in the process, what can be improved. So we want absolute honesty. Just feel free to really tell us how things are feeling. It's also really important because it helps us to then understand whether the process feels balanced and fair, regardless of your views on one issue or another. And this is why there are some of those questions about your views in the questionnaire. But it's really important to note that this is anonymous. You will not be identifiable. So, and we are taking very, very strict measures to make sure that doesn't happen. We have been through the ethics processes at the university as well as in government. So you can rest assured that your identity will not be disclosed. There are no right or wrong answers. So it really is just your views and your take on what we are asking. Please do try to fill in all the sections so that we can really see the spread of perspectives in all those different issues. You will see that there are some envelopes at your table. It's really important that you put the questionnaire in that envelope. Don't hand it over to your facilitator. You know, the questionnaire includes some questions about the facilitators. So, yeah. So we want you to really feel free to say how things are working out for you, and therefore, just make sure that you pop the questionnaire in the envelope. Now, by now you have noticed that there is not a lot of elbow room at your table. We appreciate that. That's going to get better in the next weekend that we all meet, and there will be more space. Today, we ask you to be respectful of the person next to you, because there are no right or wrong answers. There is no need to try to get it right by looking what others are writing. So please do stick to your questionnaire. We will also ask the facilitators to follow the same rule. The facilitators will not be looking into what people are doing at the table. They might want to stay at the table, or they might want to come out. It's up to them. And the most important thing is that you're honest, so that then we can take your responses, turn them into practical recommendations to the designers, to the conveners, and also to keep an eye on the quality of the process as we go over the next few weekends. So thank you for doing this. And at the end of it all, the conveners will wrap up the weekend and we will all have lunch. But this last final bit of work is really important. So we're thankful for your time. Please go ahead and enjoy the questionnaire, if that's something that can be done. Oh, I should say as well, sorry, Stephen is going to be right here, available to answer any questions. So if you got any questions, put your hand up or come to Stephen on this area of the room. Oh, yeah, the final bit, sorry, I should have remembered this. The identifier number, which is secret and is unique to you, is in your badge. So when you see at the top of the questionnaire a box, then all you need to do is to write the bit that is in the badge. Yeah. Okay, is that more or less clear and reasonable? Thank you.
I should say you have 10 minutes to complete that, but the research team are here. If you raise a card or get your facilitator to raise a card, we can come and answer questions. But on the process. So as I said a couple of times over the course of the weekend, this is a sort of introductory session. The future weekends won't be like this. For starters, they'll be longer. They'll start at 6:30 on Friday, and they'll finish at lunchtime on Sunday. There'll also be lots more opportunity for you to discuss, and also for tables to discuss with each other, and for tables to ask questions, and much more back and forth. We won't be in Edinburgh, we'll be in Glasgow. We'll be in a different room with more natural light, and we'll make sure that the setup is as spacious as it can be, so there's less light jostling and less noise from other tables. But most importantly, the next 5 weekends are about the deliberation and the discussion that we've hopefully got you on the road to today, and about identifying those challenges, and identifying the information that your fellow citizens need. So it's a really different mood for the coming weekends, and there's also more time and more flexibility to that time. It won't be so much like tick-tock on the different bits of the process. So I hope that we will see you again in a few weeks' time in Glasgow. Some practical things about right now. There are three sorts of people in the room. There are many sorts of people in the room. There are three specific sorts about lunch. Some of you have to go really quickly and have already asked for a packed lunch. If you're in that category, your packed lunch and your bag are at reception, so you can race out of the room, grab them and go. There are the other set of people who need to leave quite early, should be prioritised for going to get their bag. So go and get your bag first, and then there's lunch. Others who are like, doesn't matter, I live around the corner, take it easy, that's fine. Go and have some lunch, relax, and then get your bag afterwards, so that people who need to get their bags first because they've got to go quickly can do so. A few other practicalities. Research reports, please make sure that they are in envelopes and handed in. Ditto expenses, which we've mentioned a couple of times already. Those need to be with the Secretariat. Any practical questions at all about what worked and didn't work for you about this setup, anything that you want to talk to the Secretariat about, they will be at their desks. The table facilitators and I are going to do a bit of a wash-up ourselves on how the process worked. So any comments that you want to share with them, please do. And we will take those into account when we're designing the next 5 sessions. And I just wanted to add my personal thanks for a really fantastic and energising weekend. It's not often that you get to like lunchtime on Sunday and there's still a really loud buzz in the room and everyone's chattering away and it's hard to bring the conversations to a close. Normally people are desperate to go, or at least desperate to have lunch. So I won't pause you from having lunch any longer, other than to introduce David and Kate to close off the session.
Thanks very much. And as Anthony has just said, we are the only thing standing between you and lunch, so we're going to make this very, very short. I just wanted to formally close the first session of the First Citizens' Assembly of Scotland by giving my sincere thanks to all of you in the room for engaging in such a lively way and such an enthusiastic way, and also to thank everybody who's made this weekend kind of run so smoothly until we read the feedback. So my sincere thanks to you. I hope this weekend has worked to make some connections between each other and also with ourselves. And I was going to say I hope you're better equipped to come back next time, but I don't think that's not the right phrase. I hope we're more evenly equipped to come back at the end of November and to get right down to business quite quickly. And I just wanted to reiterate that as we grow as an assembly, there will be many more opportunities to discuss from the floor to each other, inter-table discussions going on. So just hold those thoughts. But for now, I'll say till we meet again. And even though we're in Edinburgh, you'll not have had your lunch, but you will have it now. So thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.